26 February, 1918. Elements of the 18th Infantry, 1st Division, are manning a trench system in the Bois de Renere, facing the German 78th Reserve Division. A sudden German barrage of phosgene catches the Americans unaware and unmasked. 849 shells fired into a 600 by 200 meter area. Of 230 soldiers in the target area, the Americans suffer 85 gas casualties, including 8 killed in action. These grim numbers were caused by a lack of training, ignorance of chemical employment techniques, and unfamiliarity with protective equipment. In the 70 years since that first use of chemical weapons, we have improved our training and our understanding of how wearing protective gear degrades the ability to perform the battlefield mission. For example, we now have statistical evidence that on the offense, attacks take 20% longer, and leaders are twice as likely to be casualties in the nuclear chemical environment. The Combined Arms in a Nuclear and Chemical Environment, CANE, testing program is a series of force-on-force field tests with real-time casualty assessment that measures degradation in combined arms force operation. CANE's findings show that training in an NBC environment is the key to successful operations on the chemical battlefield. It shows, too, that mission results can be improved by planning, practice, and performing the mission-essential task while wearing mission-oriented protective posture, MOP gear. In World War I, American doughboys found that units with leaders and troops who were well trained had fewer casualties than those with less training. CANE shows that the same holds true today. In October 1918, the 113th and 114th Regiments, 29th Division, were ordered to take the Bois d'Ormont along the Meuse River. They were immediately hit with toxic chemical and HE fire, forcing them to mask and slowing the attack. The 113th pulled back, but the 114th continued on against the advice of the division gas officer. The 114th eventually took its objective, but at great cost in casualties. That experience and similar engagements shows that general performance was degraded by operating in protective gear. Battles lasted longer, with fewer enemy targets killed. In the CANE tests, the Combined Arms Force, CAF, suffered more casualties when it was forced into MOP 4. The firing rate declined. Soldiers had difficulty locating and identifying targets. And fratricide, that is, firing on friendly troops, increased. Yet, tasks that were routine and tasks in which the unit was well trained showed little degradation. The experience of the 114th Infantry, and reinforced by CANE findings, show that training also requires leaders and staffs to understand the impact of toxic agent behavior and of enemy doctrine and employment techniques. In defensive operations, CANE findings are also similar to the effects that confronted U.S. troops in France when operating under toxic chemical conditions. In July 1918, the 42nd Division was ordered to help defend Suippes against an expected German attack. Defense of its sector against thousands of shells fired, 1/3 of them gas, cost the 42nd Division 1,500 casualties, up to half of them caused by gas. The troops reported that they felt that they could not wear masks and defend the position at the same time. 70 years later, the CANE tests showed that defensive operations were also degraded. General performance by the CAF was degraded by MOP 4. Soldiers had trouble locating and identifying targets. Fewer OP 4 targets were engaged, and fewer killed. Terrain was used less effectively for cover and concealment. CAF casualty rates increased. simply wearing protective clothing degraded CAF soldiers' performance. As in the offense, routine tasks and those in which the unit was well trained showed little or no degradation. Potential targets for chemical attack include commanders and their staffs. On 7 August 1918, the 354th Regiment, 89th Division, occupied the Bois de la Hazelle. The new commander of the 1st Battalion was inspecting his troops when incoming German mustard shells began bursting in the area. The battalion commander donned his mask, but too late. He became a casualty. 130 men were gassed in the vicinity of the command post, including virtually the entire battalion command group. The mustard attack left the 1st Battalion without effective command and control for several hours. Commanders must ensure that their staffs and subordinate leaders keep abreast of the situation. Subordinates must recognize when the leader becomes a casualty and take over in his absence. In Caen, command, control, and communication, C3, were generally degraded. Units were without leadership for long periods. Quality of leadership declined. Response to orders slowed. Coordination became less effective. MOP hindered recognition of leaders. Leaders' behavior degraded. They became confused, disoriented, frustrated, and irritable. There was less face-to-face communication and more arm and hand signals used. As usual, there was less degradation of routine tasks when the unit was well trained. The World War I experience with toxic chemicals also illustrates the findings of Caen in the area of fire support. At Chateau Thierry in May 1918, the 3rd Division was online to help stop the last great German offensive of the war. The German attack had come to a halt when it outran its supplies. But by 15 July, they were ready to resume the offensive. The Allies knew of the attack plans, and just before 0 hour, every Allied gun on the Marne front opened up. 3rd Division artillery alone fired 3,000 mustard shells, aimed primarily at German artillery batteries. Despite the Allied fire, the Germans began their artillery preparation, but were prevented from firing their planned program of 200,000 gas shells. Forced to retreat, the Germans used a great amount of gas in counter-battery fire. Though both sides hurt each other with chemicals, the 3rd Division appears to have had the worst of it because it allowed an entire German division to break contact without casualties. Regarding fire support in the Caen tests, calls for fire lasted longer, and preparation for fire took longer. In the field artillery battery, laying the battery took longer, and the FDC took longer to become operational. The FIST found it harder to locate targets. In the heavy mortar platoon, leadership tasks took longer, and performance degraded over time. As before, less degradation occurred in tasks in which the unit was well trained or which were routine. Along with the frontline infantry and artillery units, combat service support units were also targets of German artillery in World War I. In late October 1918, the 79th Division was attacking in the Troyes sector. Defending German units, weak and worn out, decided that mustard gas was their only chance to stop the Allied advance. The 315th Ambulance Company at Les Espinges was struck. 1 killed, 17 wounded in action. The company was able to leave the area, but unable to treat the wounded while doing so. In World War I, the Combat Service Support, CSS units, were degraded by gas casualties and forced to move, as were infantry units. Modern-day CSS units participating in the Caen tests found they also were adversely affected by enemy use of simulated toxic agents. The Kane tests showed that units needed training in preparing for chemical defensive operations, employment of chemical alarms, donning MOP 4, basic skills decontamination, and crossing contaminated areas. Combat vehicles failed to properly close and secure vehicle access openings during decontamination operations. Engineers required more time to perform their missions. Casualty evacuation to the battalion aid station was adversely affected. However, units trained in chemical operations suffered less degradation and fewer casualties. More planning is needed for log pack operations in the NCE, and more fuel is required. The lessons learned in World War I and Kane are applicable today. Mustard and nerve agents were used in the Iran-Iraq War. The agents were devastating against unprepared, unsuspecting, and untrained personnel. In Operation Desert Storm, the threat of toxic agents was always imminent. Chemical weapons are cheap, simple to make, and easy to disseminate. For its part, the Army is working to improve equipment and to help us do our job faster, better, and in greater comfort. The Army is also examining its force structure and equipment to better support NBC operations. Our doctrine of contamination avoidance, flexible MOP usage, decontamination, and work-rest cycles must be practiced in normal training activities. Units must also train in performing their mission tasks in the NCE. Once these activities become routine actions, we are well on the way to winning in a chemical war. It has been said that our units succeeded in Desert Storm because soldiers, even when confused and uncertain of their environment, were disciplined, well-trained, and had confidence in their leaders. If soldiers are not held to the highest standards in training, they will pay the price when the training stops and the fighting starts.